Hey, you made it. Soften your shoulders, and let's gently step into a slow story about the underworld. In the ancient Greek world, death was not imagined as a dramatic transformation into something greater or worse. It was, instead, a quiet subtraction. Life left the body, warmth faded, breath stilled, and what remained was a shadow of what had once been fully present. This understanding shaped every story, ritual, and fear surrounding the underworld. To begin a slow journey into that realm, it is essential to understand how the Greeks thought about death itself, because their underworld was not built on moral reward or punishment, but on continuity, memory, and loss. For most ancient Greeks, the afterlife was not a promise. It was an expectation of diminishment. Existence continued, but without the vivid intensity of the living world. Strength, ambition, hunger, love, and joy belonged to life. Death meant persistence without fullness. The soul did not ascend to perfection or descend into flames. It drifted into a quieter state, stripped of urgency, dwelling in a realm that mirrored life only faintly. This belief appears clearly in the earliest Greek literature. In the Homeric epics, the dead are described as shades, thin, insubstantial versions of their former selves. They speak softly. They remember who they were, but they no longer possess the power to act. When the hero Odysseus encounters the spirits of the dead, they do not rush toward him with enlightenment or moral judgment. They gather slowly, drawn by the scent of blood, longing for even a brief taste of sensation. What they miss most is not reward or justice, but presence. The Greeks used the word psyche to describe the soul, but this soul was not a moral ledger. It was closer to breath or life force than to personality. When death occurred, the psyche departed the body like a final exhale. What traveled onward was not the full self as modern audiences imagine it, but an echo, memory without agency, awareness without power. This distinction matters. The ancient Greek afterlife was not designed to correct life's injustices. If someone suffered greatly while living, death did not promise compensation. If someone lived cruelly or selfishly, death did not guarantee punishment. Fate ruled life, and fate did not suddenly become fair when life ended. Because of this, Greek attitudes toward death were complex and often deeply melancholic. Life was precious precisely because it was finite and vivid. Death was feared not for pain, but for emptiness. To lose the sun, the sea, conversation, and touch was the true loss. In later centuries, especially during the classical period, philosophers attempted to soften or reinterpret this view. Thinkers like Plato introduced ideas of the soul's refinement, cycles of rebirth, and moral consequence after death. But even these concepts never fully displaced the older vision. For the average Greek citizen, farmer, sailor, artisan, soldier, the underworld remained a place of quiet endurance rather than moral theater. This is why Greek heroes clung so fiercely to life, even when burdened by suffering. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, speaks plainly when encountered in death. He does not celebrate glory. He does not boast of eternal honor. He says that he would rather be a living laborer than a king among the dead. This statement alone reveals the emotional core of Greek belief. Death was not an upgrade, it was a reduction. The gods themselves reinforced this idea. Olympian deities were immortal, ageless, and vibrantly alive. They feasted, argued, desired, and interfered endlessly in human affairs. Mortals, by contrast, burned briefly and faded. The division between gods and humans was not simply power, it was permanence. To die was to leave the realm of divine attention and enter a quieter order governed by distance. The underworld was that order. It existed not as an inversion of life, but as its shadowed continuation. It had geography, rulers, borders, and laws, but it lacked momentum. Nothing truly began there. Nothing meaningfully ended either. It was a realm of arrival without departure, presence without progress. This worldview also explains why the Greeks placed enormous importance on burial rites. The afterlife itself could not be improved. but the journey into it could be disrupted. Without proper rites, the soul might wander, restless and incomplete, unable to enter the underworld at all. This was worse than death itself. To exist between worlds, unseen and unanchored, was the greatest fear. Death, then, was not a single moment. It was a process. It began with the separation of body and soul, continued through ritual and remembrance, and concluded only when the dead found their place among the countless shades who had gone before. Importantly, the underworld was not imagined as evil. It was not a place of torment by default. It was neutral, cold, still. Its silence was not malicious. It was simply the absence of life's noise. Later traditions, particularly Roman reinterpretations and much later religious frameworks, would reshape the underworld into something more moralized. But in its original Greek form, it remained stubbornly unjudgmental. A fisherman and a king entered the same darkness. A hero and a coward lost the same warmth. This did not mean that the Greeks lacked ideas of justice. Justice existed in life, enforced by gods, cities, and customs. After death, justice gave way to order. The dead were sorted not by goodness, but by circumstance, exception, or divine attention. Most souls went to the same quiet fields, regardless of how brightly or dimly they had lived. Understanding this helps explain the emotional tone of Greek myth. Stories of descent into the underworld are not triumphant. They are solemn, heavy, and filled with longing. Mortals who journey there do not seek wisdom or absolution. They seek reunion, answers, or escape, and they almost always fail to bring anything lasting back with them. The Greeks did not romanticize death. They ritualized it. They did not celebrate it. They endured it. And they spoke of it with a seriousness that reflected their belief that life was the only true stage for meaning. As we begin this slow journey into the Greek underworld, it is essential to leave behind modern assumptions. This is not a story about moral reckoning. It is not a tale of punishment or paradise. It is a quiet exploration of what remains when motion stops. The underworld is not waiting to judge you. It is waiting to receive you. And once you arrive, you will understand why the Greeks treasured the light so deeply, because they believed with calm certainty that once it was gone, it would never fully return. This belief shaped everything that followed. It shaped how death was approached, how the dead were honored, and how the journey beyond life was imagined. And now, with that understanding in place, the journey can begin. Death will no longer be an idea. It will become an event. The precise moment when life loosens its hold and the soul begins to drift away from the warmth of the living world. The descent starts there. In Greek thought, death did not announce itself with spectacle. It did not arrive as revelation or judgment. It appeared quietly, often unnoticed at first, marked by absence rather than action. Breath slowed, warmth withdrew, and the body remained in place while something essential loosened and slipped free. The Greeks understood dying as a transition, not an instant. Even when death came suddenly, through violence, illness, or accident, the soul did not vanish. It separated. Life released its hold gradually, and the moment of death stretched into a fragile interval where the living and the dead briefly overlapped. The figure most closely associated with this moment was Thanatos, the personification of death. Unlike later cultural images of death as cruel or predatory, Thanatos was restrained and inevitable. He did not hunt. He arrived when the time set by fate had been reached. His presence did not inspire panic so much as finality. Thanatos was often depicted alongside Hypnos, the embodiment of sleep. This pairing reflected a deep Greek intuition. Sleep was death's closest relative. Sleep removed awareness temporarily. Death removed it permanently. Falling asleep each night was understood as a rehearsal, a small surrender that mirrored the greater one to come. In myth, Thanatos sometimes cut a lock of hair from the dying, symbolically severing the bond between body and soul. This act did not destroy the soul, it freed it. The psyche emerged quietly, no longer anchored to flesh, hovering close to the body it had inhabited. The Greek psyche was not imagined as a radiant duplicate of the living person. It was thinner, quieter, and less defined. Poets described it as a shadow, a breath, or a faint image, recognizable but diminished. It carried memory without strength, awareness without agency. At the moment of separation, the newly dead were believed to experience confusion rather than fear. Sensation faded unevenly, sight dimmed, sound softened. The body could no longer respond, but the soul remained aware that something irreversible had occurred. This interval between death and departure was deeply unsettling in Greek belief. The soul had left the body, but it had not yet begun its journey. It lingered near familiar places, close to those it had known, uncertain and exposed. Because of this vulnerability, death was not considered complete until the living acted. Funeral rites were not symbolic comforts for mourners alone. They were necessary acts that allowed the soul to move forward. Without them, the dead remained suspended. Greek literature is filled with stories of souls who lingered. Because rites were denied, these were not violent spirits driven by anger. They were restless shades, defined by incompletion. Their suffering came from delay, not punishment. During this period, the soul was believed to observe the living. It watched the washing of the body, the closing of the eyes, the preparation for burial. These actions mattered. They signaled recognition. They told the soul it had not been forgotten. Emotionally, this was imagined as a moment of deep longing. The dead did not forget life immediately. They remembered warmth, movement, conversation, and touch. These memories did not console them. They sharpened the sense of loss. Greek myth rarely describes comfort at death. There are no angels, no assurances, no promises of reunion. The dead were aware of what they had lost, and that awareness lingered. This belief shaped Greek attitudes toward dying. A good death was not one free from pain. It was one witnessed, acknowledged, and properly concluded. To die alone, unburied, or unrecognized was a profound tragedy. Violent deaths were especially troubling. When life ended abruptly, the soul was thought to be disoriented. Without preparation, it might resist departure, clinging to the world it had been torn from. Deaths at sea were feared for this reason. Without a body to bury, rites could not be completed. Sailors lost to the water were imagined as wandering longer than others, their souls delayed by absence. Children who died young occupied a similarly uneasy place in Greek imagination. Their identities were not yet fully formed, their lives unfinished. Myths speak sparingly of their fate, reflecting discomfort rather than certainty. Even heroes were not spared this uncertainty. Strength, courage, and divine favor mattered little once breath had left the body. At death, all souls were equally vulnerable. This understanding helps explain why Greek heroes sought lasting fame. Since the afterlife offered no true compensation, memory became a substitute for survival. To be remembered was to remain partially alive among the living. The newly dead stood at a threshold defined by stillness. They could no longer act, but they had not yet been carried away. They existed in quiet suspension, waiting for recognition, direction, and release. Once the rites were completed, the soul no longer lingered. It began to withdraw from the places it had known. Distance grew between the dead and the living, not abruptly, but steadily. Light faded, sound softened, familiar landmarks lost their clarity. The soul drifted, no longer anchored by the body or the world it had inhabited. Death, in Greek belief, was not cruel, it was indifferent. It did not seek to teach or correct. It simply separated. And in that separation, the journey inward began, away from motion, away from urgency, toward a realm where nothing pressed forward and nothing returned. The moment of dying was not an ending marked by judgment or revelation. It was a quiet release, followed by waiting, shaped by the actions of the living and the customs they upheld. Only after that waiting did the dead truly leave the world behind. In the ancient Greek world, death did not belong solely to the moment when breath ceased. It unfolded through ritual. What the living did after death mattered profoundly, not just for memory or grief, but for the fate of the soul itself. Funeral rites were not symbolic gestures. They were functional acts, believed to guide the dead out of stillness and onto their proper path. Without these rites, death remained unfinished. The responsibility of preparation fell immediately upon the living. Family members, most often women of the household, tended to the body. This act began with washing. Warm water was poured carefully over the corpse, cleansing it of dust, blood, and sweat. The body was then anointed with oils, often olive oil infused with herbs or perfumes. These substances did not preserve the body in a modern sense. They honored it. They acknowledged that this vessel had once held life. The eyes were closed by hand. The mouth was gently shut. These small actions carried enormous weight. An open mouth or staring eyes suggested unrest, as though the dead were still calling out or watching the world they had left. Closing them signaled acceptance of death's finality. After washing, the body was dressed. Clothing varied by region and status, but even the poor were wrapped with care. Burial garments were not about display. They were about dignity. To send the dead forward unclothed or neglected risked dishonor, not only to the individual, but to the family line. Once prepared, the body was laid out for prothesis, the period of viewing and mourning. The dead were placed on a bier, usually within the home, feet facing outward toward the door. This orientation was deliberate. It symbolized departure. The dead no longer belonged facing inward, toward domestic life. During prothesis, mourners gathered. Lamentation was not restrained. It was expected. Wailing, crying, tearing of garments, and rhythmic expressions of grief were culturally sanctioned. These displays were not considered weakness. They were acts of acknowledgement. To grieve openly was to affirm that a life had mattered. Mourning songs were sometimes improvised, sometimes traditional. They named the dead, recalled deeds, and expressed loss. These spoken memories served a purpose beyond comfort. They reminded the soul that it was known, remembered, and recognized. Greek belief held that the soul lingered nearby during this time. It listened, it observed. The sound of voices mattered. Silence was dangerous. A death unnoticed or unacknowledged left the soul without direction. At dawn, the body was carried out in a procession known as the ekphora. This usually took place before sunrise, when streets were quiet and the boundary between night and day remained thin. The timing was symbolic. The dead departed in darkness, not under the full authority of the sun. The procession moved slowly. Family members followed the bier, sometimes accompanied by musicians or mourners. This was the final public acknowledgement of the dead's presence among the living. Burial practices varied across time and region. In some periods, cremation was common. In others, inhumation, burial in the earth, was preferred. Neither was considered inherently superior. What mattered was completion. For cremation, the body was placed on a pyre. Fire transformed flesh into ash, releasing the soul fully from physical remains. The ashes were collected carefully and placed in an urn or grave. The act of gathering ashes reinforced continuity. Even in destruction, care persisted. For burial, the body was placed in a grave, sometimes with simple offerings, pottery, personal items, or tokens of identity. These objects were not imagined as luxuries for the afterlife. They were markers. They signaled belonging. Among the most important items placed with the dead was the coin. A small obol was often positioned in the mouth or on the eyes. This coin served as passage payment, ensuring the soul could move forward without delay. The act of giving the coin was as much about readiness as economics. A soul without payment was not condemned, but it was delayed. Delay meant wandering. Wandering meant unrest. After burial, mourning continued. Families observed periods of ritual impurity. Certain activities were avoided. Offerings were made at the grave on specific days following death. These acts reinforced the bond between the living and the dead, even as separation increased. Importantly, Greek funerary practices emphasized balance. Excessive mourning was discouraged over time. Grief had its place, but life had to resume. Lingering too long in sorrow risked tethering the soul unnecessarily. Proper rites did not keep the dead close, they helped them move on. The greatest fear surrounding funerary practice was failure. To be denied burial was a fate worse than death itself. Greek myths return repeatedly to this theme. Unburied bodies appear as sources of pollution, unrest, and divine anger. The dead without rites were imagined as wandering near the world of the living, unable to cross fully into the underworld. These souls did not rest, they waited. Such figures were not villains. They were reminders of obligation. Their presence demanded action from the living. This belief extended into law and warfare. Even enemies were often granted burial after battle. To deny burial was to invite cosmic imbalance. Death had rules, and humans were expected to honor them. The role of women in funerary rites deserves particular attention. Women prepared bodies, led lamentation, and maintained grave offerings. Through these acts, they served as mediators between life and death. Their work was not peripheral, it was essential. Despite this central role, women were also subject to regulation. Excessive mourning could be restricted by law, reflecting a tension between emotional expression and social order. Children participated in funerary rituals as observers. Through repetition, they learned that death was not hidden, it was integrated into communal life. The Greeks did not sanitize death, they ritualized it. Funeral rites marked a shift. Once completed, the soul no longer lingered. It began to withdraw from the household, the city, the land it had known. Memory remained, but proximity faded. Graves became points of contact rather than residence. Offerings honored, but did not anchor. Through ritual, the living fulfilled their responsibility. They acknowledged death, honored life, and released the soul. Only then was the dead truly prepared. Not prepared for reward or punishment, but for distance, for silence. For the long road away from the warmth of voices and toward a realm shaped by stillness rather than motion. Funeral rites did not change what awaited the dead. They changed how the dead arrived. And in Greek belief, arrival mattered. In Greek imagination, the underworld was not reached by sudden collapse or instant removal. It was approached. Distance mattered. The journey away from the living world unfolded gradually, as though the soul needed time to release its grip on familiar ground. The Greeks did not agree on a single entrance to the realm of the dead. Instead, they imagined many thresholds scattered across the landscape. These places were not random. They were liminal spaces where the world already felt thin, quiet, or unstable. Caves were among the most common imagined entrances. Their darkness swallowed sound and light quickly, and their depth suggested continuation beyond sight. To descend into a cave was to leave the sun behind without crossing water or sky. It was a physical reminder of how easily the world could close in on itself. Mountains also carried this weight. High passes and shadowed ravines were believed to brush against divine and chthonic realms alike. Winds howled where paths narrowed. Echoes distorted voices. Orientation faltered. These sensations made mountains feel closer to the unseen. Rivers marked another boundary. Water already separated spaces. City from countryside, shore from sea. In myth, rivers flowing into darkness or vanishing underground suggested movement toward another order of existence. The sound of water masked other noises, creating isolation even in open terrain. Certain locations became famous for their association with descent. The region around Lake Avernus in Italy, later adopted into Greek myth, was said to exhale toxic vapors that killed birds in flight. Such places felt hostile to life, reinforcing the idea that death lay nearby. In Greece itself, sites like Tynaron a cave at the southern tip of the Peloponnese, were believed to open directly into the underworld. The land there ended abruptly. Beyond it lay only sea and sky. Standing at such edges made the concept of departure tangible. These entrances were not guarded in the way later myths imagine. There were no blazing gates or walls of flame. The danger lay in crossing unnoticed. Mortals who wandered too close without purpose risked becoming lost, not physically but spiritually. For the soul, the road beyond the world was not a single path. It was a gradual withdrawal from familiarity. As distance grew, landmarks lost meaning. The living world did not vanish at once, it faded. Sound was among the first things to change. Voices became indistinct. Footsteps no longer echoed with clarity. Wind no longer carried recognizable sense. The soul moved through a space that felt increasingly emptied of human presence. Light followed. It dimmed without extinguishing. Shadows lengthened. Color drained. This was not darkness as terror, but darkness as neutrality. The absence of contrast flattened perception. Time behaved differently as well. Movement did not feel urgent. There was no sense of arriving late or early. The road did not demand haste. It simply extended. This lack of urgency distinguished the journey of the dead from that of the living. In life, roads are purposeful. They connect places of need. In death, the road existed for its own sake. Greek poets often describe this journey as solitary. The soul did not travel in crowds, even though countless souls departed daily. Each one experienced the road alone. Companionship belonged to life. The absence of physical sensation was gradual. At first, memory substituted for feeling. The soul remembered warmth without feeling it. It recalled hunger without discomfort. These memories thinned as distance increased. This thinning was not violent. It was attritional. Awareness narrowed. Details blurred. What remained was identity stripped to essentials. The road itself was rarely described in detail. This absence was intentional. To define it too clearly would grant it texture, and texture belonged to life. Instead, the road was implied through negation, what was no longer present. Some myths describe the dead passing through fields or plains before reaching the true boundary of the underworld. These spaces were quiet and unmarked. No structures rose. No destinations beckoned. They existed as buffers between worlds. These intermediate spaces reinforced a key Greek idea. Death was not an event, but a movement. The living world receded behind the soul like a shoreline disappearing into mist. Importantly, this road was not morally weighted. No obstacles tested virtue. No trials measured worth. The soul was not required to prove anything. The absence of challenge was itself unsettling. Without struggle, there was no affirmation. The journey offered no opportunity for redemption or failure. Some souls resisted this movement. Myths speak of those who lingered, clinging to places of strong attachment. Love, anger, unfinished business, these emotions could delay departure. Such delay was not permanent. The road waited. Even heroes who had crossed into the underworld and returned described the journey as heavy with quiet pressure. Not fear, but inevitability. When mortals entered these paths while alive, through divine favor or extraordinary circumstance, they experienced disorientation. Their senses rebelled. Their bodies resisted the thinning of perception meant for the dead. This resistance marked them as intruders. The road was not designed for flesh. For the dead, however, the road did not reject. It absorbed. Geography dissolved as the journey continued. Direction lost meaning. The concepts of north and south, up and down, no longer applied. What remained was motion without destination. The Greeks imagined this stage as deeply quiet. Silence here was not the absence of sound, but the absence of interruption. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing intruded. This silence prepared the soul for what lay ahead, not through instruction, but through erasure. Life's noise fell away piece by piece. The road beyond the world did not punish, it did not comfort, it did not explain. It carried. And as it carried the soul farther from warmth and memory, the final boundary approached, not with spectacle, but with stillness thick enough to feel like substance. At that boundary, water would appear, and the road would no longer belong to the dead alone. Water marked the first boundary that could not be undone. In Greek belief, land could be revisited, paths retraced, and thresholds crossed more than once. Water was different. To cross certain waters was to accept separation. Once the soul reached the rivers of the underworld, the living world no longer existed as a place that could be returned to, only remembered. The dead did not arrive at these waters suddenly. The approach was gradual. The air grew heavier, sound flattened. Movement slowed, as if the world itself resisted forward motion. Then the water appeared, not shimmering or reflective, but dark, opaque, and indifferent. The Greeks imagined several rivers flowing through the realm of the dead. These were not ordinary waterways. Each carried a specific emotional and symbolic weight, shaping the experience of the crossing. At the edge of these rivers stood Charon. Charon was not a god in the Olympian sense. He did not intervene in human affairs. He did not judge. He existed to perform a function that never changed. He ferried the dead. Ancient descriptions portray him as aged, stern, and unsympathetic. His appearance was deliberately unwelcoming. He was not there to comfort. He was there to enforce order. Charon did not speak unnecessarily. He did not explain the process. He did not reassure. The dead were not customers or supplicants. They were cargo. The presence of Charon signaled the end of ambiguity. Before this point, the soul lingered, drifted, hesitated. At the riverbank, movement stopped until conditions were met. The most famous of these conditions was payment. The coin placed with the dead during burial was intended for Charon. This payment was not portrayed as greed. It was proof of preparation. A soul that arrived without it had not been properly acknowledged by the living. Those without payment were not punished in the sense of suffering inflicted. They were refused passage. They waited. Greek sources describe these unburied or improperly buried souls wandering the riverbank, sometimes for years. They could see the crossing, they could hear the water, but they could not move forward. This delay was among the greatest fears associated with death. Not torment, but stagnation. Not pain, but suspension. Charon's refusal was final, not cruel. He did not debate. He did not accept excuses. Order mattered more than circumstance. When the conditions were met, the crossing began. The boat itself was described as small and heavy, its wood darkened by age and use. It did not glide. It moved slowly, cutting through the water without ceremony. Souls boarded in silence. There was no seating arrangement, no conversation. Each soul faced forward, not because they were instructed to, but because looking back served no purpose. The river most commonly associated with this crossing was Acheron, the river of sorrow. Its waters were dark and sluggish, carrying the emotional weight of grief and loss. To cross it was to acknowledge separation. Other rivers flowed deeper within the underworld, each shaping the realm in different ways. The Styx was the most feared. It represented inviolable oath, an absolute consequence. Gods themselves swore by the Styx, and to break such an oath brought severe punishment. Its presence reinforced the idea that some boundaries could never be crossed back. Phlegethon burned, not with fire as flame, but with a sense of consuming force. It represented destruction without purpose, energy stripped of creation. Cocytus flowed with lamentation. Its waters echoed grief, not as noise, but as emotional residue. It carried the sorrow of those who mourned and those who were mourned. Lethe, the river of forgetting, flowed quietly and without drama. Its waters dulled memory, softening the sharpness of identity. Not all souls encountered it immediately, but its presence shaped the atmosphere of the realm. These rivers were not obstacles to overcome. They were processes to undergo. The crossing itself was slow. Time did not pass in a measurable way. The sensation was one of drifting rather than travel. As the boat moved forward, the living world receded completely. There was no final glimpse of home, no dramatic farewell. Familiarity dissolved without announcement. Sound disappeared next. The water made no splash. The oar made no rhythm. Silence thickened. This silence was not peaceful in the comforting sense. It was neutral, unresponsive. The soul remained aware, but awareness no longer attached to sensation. Thoughts slowed, emotion dulled. The Greeks did not imagine terror during the crossing. Fear required urgency, and urgency belonged to life. Instead, the dominant sensation was resignation. Even those who resisted death in life did not struggle here. Resistance required a body. Charon did not look at the souls during the crossing. He did not acknowledge them. His focus remained fixed ahead. The destination mattered more than the passengers. This reinforced a core Greek idea. Death was impersonal. It did not care who you were. Heroes crossed beside farmers. Kings crossed beside servants. Reputation dissolved. Those rare mortals who crossed while alive, heroes favored by gods, experienced this moment differently. Their bodies resisted the thinning of perception. Their senses strained against the silence. This resistance marked them as temporary. The river tolerated them, but did not welcome them. For the dead, however, the crossing was final. Once the boat reached the far shore, Charon did not assist with disembarkation. Souls stepped off without instruction. The boat did not wait. It turned back immediately. The far shore offered no greeting. No guardians welcomed arrivals. No signs announced location. What mattered was not arrival, but completion. The crossing itself finalized separation. At this point, the soul no longer belonged to the world of the living in any meaningful way. Memory remained, but attachment weakened. The rivers did not cleanse. They did not punish. They removed. They stripped away immediacy, urgency, and the illusion of return. The Greeks understood water as both boundary and eraser. To cross these rivers was to accept stillness as the new condition of existence. Once the crossing ended, the road behind no longer mattered. Only what lay ahead remained. And what lay ahead did not rush forward to meet the dead. It waited. Beyond the rivers stood a boundary that did not shift or flow. It did not drift like water or thin like air. It remained fixed, unmoving, and absolute. This boundary marked the true entrance into the realm of the dead. The Greeks imagined this threshold as a gate, not always a physical structure of stone or iron, but a condition of no return. To pass it was to accept permanence. Guarding this boundary was Cerberus. Cerberus was not a monster created for cruelty. He was a creature of function. His role was simple and unchanging, to prevent the dead from leaving and the living from entering. Ancient descriptions vary in detail but agree in essence. Cerberus possessed multiple heads, most often 3, each vigilant and alert. His body was massive, his jaws powerful, his presence unmistakable. Serpents sometimes formed his mane or tail, reinforcing his chthonic nature. What Cerberus represented mattered more than how he looked. He was not a punisher. He did not torment the dead. He did not attack souls who passed through. His aggression was directional. It faced outward. Cerberus was terrifying only to those who attempted to violate the boundary he guarded. For the dead, he was not an obstacle. He was confirmation. The Greeks understood Cerberus as a symbol of finality. Once the soul passed him, there was no turning back. The gate he guarded did not open again for those who crossed fully. This idea is central to understanding Greek views of death. The underworld was not a prison. Souls were not held against their will. They simply no longer belonged elsewhere. Cerberus ensured that order remained intact. The gates themselves were rarely described in concrete terms. Sometimes they were imagined as doors, sometimes as arches, sometimes as nothing more than a narrowing of space where the world beyond ceased to resemble anything living. What mattered was not material, but function. The gate marked the transition from passage to residence. Before it, the soul was still moving. After it, movement ceased to have direction. This boundary also explained why ghosts were considered abnormal. Souls that appeared among the living were believed to exist because something had gone wrong. Either the rites were incomplete, or the soul had not passed fully through the gate. A properly buried soul did not wander back. Cerberus's presence reinforced this certainty. He was not there to threaten the dead, but to reassure the living that separation was secure. Greek myth offers rare exceptions to this rule, and their rarity emphasizes its strength. Heroes such as Heracles entered the underworld while alive. His encounter with Cerberus was not a battle for survival, but a test of authority. Heracles subdued Cerberus without weapons, demonstrating that only extraordinary force, sanctioned by divine will, could bypass the gate. Even then, Cerberus was not destroyed. He was returned to his post. This detail is significant. The gate could be breached, but never removed. Orpheus passed Cerberus through music, not violence. His lyre lulled the guardian into stillness. This did not negate Cerberus's role. It confirmed that art and divine favor could momentarily suspend natural order, but not replace it. These myths do not undermine the rule. They highlight it. No ordinary soul passed Cerberus twice. For the dead, the experience of passing the gate was not dramatic. There was no fear, no challenge, no sense of being tested. Fear belonged to those who still had something to lose. Instead, the sensation was one of compression. Space felt denser. Awareness narrowed. The openness of the road ended. The gate did not close behind the soul. It simply ceased to matter. Beyond this boundary, the underworld no longer resembled a path or journey. It became a domain. The Greeks imagined this realm as vast but static. Unlike the world of the living, where movement created change, movement here led nowhere new. Cerberus remained at the threshold, eternally alert, eternally unchanged. He did not age, he did not tire, he did not grow bored. This timelessness reflected the nature of death itself. Nothing progressed, nothing decayed further, nothing improved. The presence of Cerberus also clarified a misunderstanding common in later interpretations. He was not there to terrify souls into obedience. Obedience was no longer relevant. The dead did not rebel. Cerberus guarded the gate not because the dead wanted to escape, but because escape was conceptually impossible. In Greek thought, death was not a place you endured until release. It was a condition. The gate marked the acceptance of that condition. For the living, Cerberus embodied anxiety about boundaries. He represented the fear that death could be undone, that the dead might return, that order could collapse. For the dead, he represented certainty. Once past him, ambiguity ended. The gate did not judge. It did not select. It did not reward. It admitted. On the far side, the atmosphere changed completely. Sound did not echo. Light did not vary. Space extended without offering orientation. This was the interior of the underworld. Cerberus did not follow. He remained where boundaries mattered. Within the realm itself, no guardian was needed. The dead did not need watching. They did not seek to leave. They had arrived. The Greeks imagined this arrival not as relief, but as settling, a lowering of intensity, a reduction of tension. Nothing pressed forward. Nothing pulled back. The gate behind faded from awareness. The guardian's presence receded into irrelevance. What remained was existence without urgency. Cerberus continued his watch, unseen by those who had passed him, ensuring that the division between worlds remained intact. In this way, he was not a monster of fear, but a mechanism of balance. A reminder that some lines, once crossed, no longer existed to be crossed again. Within the interior of the underworld, authority did not announce itself with spectacle. There were no thrones raised above crowds, no proclamations carried on wind. Power here was quiet, structural, and absolute. The realm functioned because it was governed, not because it was feared. At the center of this order stood Hades. In Greek belief, Hades was not a devil nor a figure of cruelty. He was a god of boundaries. His domain was not punishment, but possession. Everything that died belonged to him, not because he desired it, but because death itself required custody. Hades rarely appeared in myth compared to other Olympians. This absence was intentional. He did not roam the world. He did not seduce mortals or interfere constantly in human affairs. His power was not performative. It was permanent. The Greeks understood Hades as wealthy, not evil. His other name, Pluton, emphasized abundance, not of gold alone, but of everything hidden beneath the earth. Crops grew from soil enriched by decay. Metals rested underground. The dead accumulated in his realm. Possession, not malice, defined him. Unlike Zeus, whose authority relied on enforcement, or Poseidon, whose moods shaped the sea, Hades ruled by inevitability. No one argued with him. No one appealed successfully for exemption. Even the gods respected his boundaries. The underworld was not chaotic. It had structure, expectation, and continuity. Souls arrived, were received, and settled. This stability reflected the temperament of its ruler. Hades was not imagined as cruel to the dead. He did not torment them. He did not judge them personally. Judgment, when it occurred, was delegated. Hades ensured that the realm functioned, not that it punished. His palace, when described at all, was not ornate. It was vast, shadowed, and still. Light did not behave normally there. Surfaces absorbed rather than reflected. Space extended without invitation. This environment mirrored its ruler. Hades was firm, reserved, and unyielding, but not capricious. He did not take pleasure in suffering. He did not create pain for entertainment. His severity lay in his refusal to alter what had been set. Beside him ruled Persephone. Persephone embodied contradiction. She belonged simultaneously to life and death, growth and stillness. Her presence softened the rigidity of the underworld without undermining its permanence. Her story began above ground, where she was associated with spring, vegetation, and renewal. Her abduction into the underworld marked a rupture, not only for her, but for the natural order. The Greeks told this story not to romanticize violence, but to explain rhythm. Persephone's movement between realms explained seasonal change. When she descended, the earth grew barren. When she returned, life re-emerged. In the underworld, Persephone was not a captive, she was a queen. Her authority was real and recognized. She did not challenge Hades' rule, she complemented it. Where his presence emphasized permanence, hers introduced variation. This duality mattered deeply. It prevented the underworld from becoming a place of absolute stagnation. Persephone's presence acknowledged that life and death were not enemies, but phases. Persephone was associated with mercy, not release. She could hear petitions. She could soften outcomes. But she did not overturn fate. Myths in which she intervenes are rare and carefully framed. She aids those with strong emotional claims, artistic gifts, or divine backing. Even then, her assistance does not erase consequence. Her role reflected a broader Greek understanding. Compassion existed within structure, not against it. Together, Hades and Persephone ruled without spectacle. They did not appear to inspire awe. Their authority was assumed. This contrasted sharply with later portrayals of the underworld as a place ruled by fear. In Greek belief, fear diminished once death was complete. Anxiety belonged to the living. The dead did not rebel against Hades. They did not scheme for escape. Escape was not meaningful. This acceptance did not imply contentment. It implied adjustment. The rulers of the underworld did not demand worship from the dead. Worship was a practice of the living. The dead existed beyond such transactions. This separation reinforced an important boundary. Religion governed life. Order governed death. Hades was invoked sparingly by the living. His name itself was often avoided, replaced with euphemisms. To speak of him casually was to invite proximity to death. This avoidance did not indicate hatred. It reflected respect. Persephone, by contrast, was invoked in agricultural rituals. Her return promised renewal. Her departure explained loss. Together, they linked human experience to cosmic rhythm. Their marriage was not framed as romantic fulfillment. It was functional. It stabilized the boundary between worlds. The Greeks did not imagine the underworld as morally inverted. Good did not rise. Evil did not sink. Both arrived. Hades did not correct injustice. Persephone did not erase sorrow. Their realm reflected the world as it was, not as it should have been. This realism distinguished Greek mythology from later systems that moralized the afterlife. The underworld was not an answer. It was a continuation under different conditions. The presence of rulers ensured consistency, not consolation. For the dead, encountering Hades and Persephone was not a meeting in the conversational sense. It was recognition. The soul understood, without explanation, that authority existed and was unalterable. There was no negotiation. There was no appeal. The rulers did not need to speak. Their existence structured the realm invisibly. Paths formed, regions differentiated, processes unfolded. This silent governance allowed the underworld to function without constant intervention. It also allowed the dead to settle into stillness without confusion. In Greek thought, confusion was more troubling than sorrow. Uncertainty created unrest. Structure created endurance. Hades and Persephone provided that structure. They did not offer hope of return. They did not threaten punishment. They maintained balance. And in that balance the dead remained, neither suffering endlessly nor rewarded eternally, simply existing. The authority of the underworld was not oppressive because it was not contested. There was nothing to contest. The dead did not imagine alternatives. They did not dream of elsewhere. Dreams belong to sleep. Sleep belonged to life. Here, beneath the world, rulership was not felt as weight, but as absence of motion. Nothing pressed forward. Nothing collapsed inward. The realm held. And within that holding, the dead found their place. Judgment in the Greek underworld did not resemble a trial in the human sense. There were no speeches, no defense, no appeal to mercy. What occurred was quieter and more restrained, shaped by order rather than emotion. The purpose was not to reward virtue or punish wrongdoing, but to place each soul where it belonged. The Greeks imagined three judges of the dead: Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. Each had ruled in life, and each had become associated with law, fairness, and restraint. Their authority in death did not elevate them into divine beings. It extended the responsibility they had already carried. Aeacus was often described as the first to examine arriving souls. His role emphasized threshold rather than verdict. He assessed origin and circumstance, not character. Aeacus was associated with the gates and with determining which judge would preside further. Rhadamanthus oversaw souls from outside Greece in many traditions, reflecting the expanding awareness of a wider world. His judgments were precise and unemotional. He was not swayed by reputation or pleading. He represented consistency. Minos held the final authority. Often depicted holding a scepter, he did not argue or deliberate aloud. His decision ended the process. Once Minos ruled, the soul moved on without delay. Importantly, this judgment was not moral in the later sense. The judges did not weigh good deeds against bad. They did not punish cruelty or reward kindness as abstract values. Greek ethics were embedded in life, not enforced after it. What the judges evaluated was life as it had been lived within the framework of fate. Certain lives were marked by exceptional circumstance. Certain deaths carried particular weight. Most lives, however, required little assessment. For the vast majority of souls, judgment was brief. Their destination was not debated. They passed quickly and quietly into the region that awaited most of the dead. This reflects a central Greek belief. Human life was not primarily about moral testing. It was about endurance within limitation. The afterlife did not exist to correct imbalance. Exceptions existed, but they were rare. Heroes favored by the gods, individuals bound by extraordinary vows, or figures who committed acts that disrupted cosmic order might be directed elsewhere. These decisions were not moral reactions. They were administrative necessities. The judges did not invent destinations. They recognized alignment. This process lacked spectacle. There was no crowd, no audience. The soul did not feel scrutinized. Judgment occurred with the inevitability of gravity. Emotion did not dominate this moment. Fear belonged to uncertainty, and by the time the soul stood before the judges, uncertainty had already thinned. Souls did not plead, because pleading required hope of reversal. Reversal did not exist. The Greeks imagined judgment as clarity rather than evaluation. The soul understood its placement without explanation. This understanding dissolved the tension that moral trials produce. There was no suspense. What followed judgment was movement without resistance. The judges themselves were not feared. They did not inflict suffering. They did not relish authority. Their presence reassured order. In later periods, philosophical traditions expanded the idea of judgment, introducing moral consequence and cycles of rebirth. These developments, while influential, did not erase earlier beliefs. For most Greeks, the judges remained functionaries, not executioners. The simplicity of this system often unsettles modern audiences. Without moral reward or punishment, judgment seems empty. But within Greek thought, this restraint was intentional. The underworld was not meant to mirror human courts. Human courts corrected behavior. The underworld maintained balance. Balance required placement, not verdict. Once judged, the soul did not linger. There was no period of reflection. Movement followed immediately. This lack of delay reinforced the idea that death removed choice. Choice belonged to life. After death, momentum replaced decision. The judges did not ask who the soul wished to be. They recognized what the soul already was. This recognition did not require interrogation. Life itself had already provided the evidence. The Greeks believed that excessive emphasis on judgment after death diminished responsibility in life. If justice waited beyond death, urgency weakened. Instead, justice was embedded in community, law, and divine oversight during life. The judges of the dead existed to sort, not to redeem. Their presence structured the underworld without moral drama. They did not console. They did not condemn. They concluded. Once their role ended, the soul moved deeper into the realm, no longer concerned with evaluation. Identity settled. Expectation dissolved. What awaited next depended not on worth, but on alignment. Most souls would find themselves in stillness shared with countless others. A few would arrive elsewhere. None would return. Judgment in the Greek underworld was not a reckoning. It was a sorting. And in that sorting, the final remnants of life's urgency fell away. The interior of the Greek underworld was not a single, uniform expanse. It was divided into regions, not by walls or borders that could be seen, but by conditions that could be felt. Movement through these regions did not resemble travel in the living world. There were no roads to follow, no distances to measure. Souls arrived where they belonged, drawn by alignment rather than direction. The Greeks imagined three primary regions within the underworld: the Asphodel Meadows, the Elysian Fields, and Tartarus. Each existed simultaneously, layered within the same realm, differentiated by atmosphere rather than separation. Most souls entered the Asphodel Meadows. The Asphodel Meadows were not a place of punishment or reward. They were the default state of death. The landscape was described as flat and pale, covered with asphodel flowers, plants associated with graves and endurance rather than beauty. These flowers did not wither, but they did not flourish either. They persisted. Light in the Asphodel Meadows was dim and diffuse. There was no true darkness, but no sun. Shadows existed without clear sources. The air was still. sound did not carry far. Souls here retained memory but lacked intensity. They remembered their names, their lives, and those they had known. But these memories did not provoke strong emotion. Joy and grief alike had dulled edges. Conversation, when imagined at all, was subdued. Voices were faint. Words mattered less than presence. The dead did not argue. They did not scheme. They did not long for change. This region reflected the Greek expectation of death, continuation without urgency, existence without purpose. The asphodel meadows were crowded, though crowding did not feel oppressive. Souls did not collide. Proximity did not require interaction. Each soul existed alongside countless others without forming bonds. This absence of relationship was one of the most unsettling aspects of the Greek afterlife. Community belonged to life. In death, individuality persisted, but connection weakened. The dead did not suffer here, but neither were they fulfilled. They endured. The Greeks did not consider this cruel. They considered it realistic. A much smaller number of souls were directed to the Elysian fields. Elysium was not heaven in the later religious sense. It was not open to all who behaved well. It was reserved for those who lived lives marked by extraordinary favor, heroism, or divine connection. Descriptions of Elysium varied across time, but certain qualities remained consistent. Light was brighter, the air was gentle. The landscape was fertile rather than barren. Souls in Elysium retained more vitality than those in the asphodel meadows. They could engage in activities resembling those they enjoyed in life: music, athletics, conversation. These were not driven by ambition, but by pleasure, without consequence. Elysium did not promise eternal growth or improvement. It offered rest. Some traditions allowed for reincarnation from Elysium, particularly in philosophical contexts. These ideas were not universally held and developed later. In earlier belief, Elysium represented exception, not system. The rarity of Elysium mattered. It reinforced the idea that death did not compensate for hardship. Only lives touched by extraordinary circumstance received extraordinary outcomes. The existence of Elysium did not undermine the neutrality of the underworld. It highlighted its rigidity. Opposite Elysium lay Tartarus. Tartarus was not simply a region, it was a depth. It existed beneath the rest of the underworld, separated by layers of distance that could not be crossed accidentally. Unlike the asphodel meadows and Elysium, Tartarus was associated with punishment. But punishment here was not corrective, it was containment. Those confined to Tartarus were not ordinary souls. They were figures whose actions disrupted cosmic order. Titans, oath-breakers among the gods, and mortals whose crimes offended the structure of reality itself. Tartarus was described as dark, vast, and heavy. The air pressed inward. Space felt constricted despite its immensity. Punishments in Tartarus were specific and unending. Sisyphus rolled his stone endlessly. Tantalus reached for water and fruit forever denied. Ixion turned upon his wheel. These punishments were not arbitrary. Each reflected the nature of the crime committed. Importantly, Tartarus was not presented as a threat to ordinary people. It was not a warning designed to enforce moral behavior. Its inhabitants were exceptional. The Greeks did not imagine common cruelty or selfishness leading to eternal torment. Tartarus was reserved for boundary violations, not moral failure. Between these regions, movement was not fluid. Souls did not wander freely from one to another. Placement was final. The underworld did not encourage aspiration. A soul in the asphodel meadows did not strive toward Elysium. Striving belonged to life. This lack of mobility reinforced the stillness of death. The regions existed not as destinations to pursue, but as conditions to inhabit. The geography of the underworld was less important than its atmosphere. The Greeks focused on how each region felt rather than how it looked. In all regions, time lacked urgency. Eternity was not experienced as endless duration, but as absence of progression. Nothing approached. Nothing concluded. This perception of eternity differs sharply from later traditions that imagined endless time as either bliss or torment. Greek eternity was flat. The dead did not count days, they did not anticipate events. Memory faded gradually, especially for those who drank from Lethe. Lethe flowed quietly through the underworld, touching all regions in different ways. Forgetting was not forced, it occurred naturally. As memories softened, identity loosened, names lost sharpness, faces blurred. This forgetting was not presented as tragedy, it was presented as relief. The Greeks feared eternal awareness more than oblivion. To remember loss forever was worse than to forget it slowly. Thus, the underworld offered not closure, but quiet. No region existed to teach lessons. No landscape demanded interpretation. The dead did not search for meaning. Meaning belonged to life. The regions of the underworld provided space for what remained after meaning had run its course. As souls settled into these regions, urgency disappeared entirely. The last remnants of desire dissolved. What remained was presence without pressure, stillness without pain, endurance without expectation. The underworld did not punish humanity for living. It simply received what was left when living ended. In the Greek understanding of death, the greatest fear was not pain. It was persistence, to remain fully aware forever, holding on to desire, grief, or regret without the ability to act, was imagined as far more unbearable than physical suffering. This is why forgetting held such power in the underworld. Memory defined life. Forgetting softened death. Within the realm of the dead flowed Lethe, the river of forgetting. Its waters did not rush, they did not sparkle. They moved slowly, quietly, without urgency or invitation. Souls were not forced to drink. Forgetting was not punishment, it was relief. As time passed, memories began to loosen on their own. Names faded first, then faces, then the sharpness of emotion. What remained longest were impressions rather than details. A sense that something had once mattered deeply, without the ability to recall exactly what it was. The Greeks did not imagine this process as tragic. They imagined it as merciful. To remember loss forever was to suffer endlessly. To forget gradually was to rest. This belief reveals something essential about Greek values. Life was precious because it was brief and intense. Death was tolerable because it dulled that intensity. Eternity, stripped of urgency and longing, became survivable. The underworld did not exist to provide meaning. Meaning was the work of the living. In death, striving ended, goals dissolved, ambition faded. What remained was existence without demand. This is why Greek myths rarely frame death as a reward. Even Elysium, the most gentle region of the underworld, did not promise growth or fulfillment. It offered calm continuation, not transcendence. The journey into the underworld was never about becoming something more. It was about becoming less. Less urgent. Less attached. Less burdened by memory. The Greeks feared eternal consciousness more than oblivion. Endless awareness meant endless comparison with what had been lost. Forgetting allowed the dead to settle without constant longing. In this way, Lethe was not an eraser of identity, but a loosening of its grip. Identity became lighter, softer, less insistent. Eventually, most souls ceased to reflect on life at all. They did not mourn, they did not celebrate, they existed. This existence was not framed as joy or suffering, it simply was. The underworld did not judge whether a life had been well lived. That judgment belonged to the living, through memory, story, and reputation. This placed enormous importance on how one was remembered. Songs, stories, and rituals preserved meaning long after the soul itself no longer cared. To be remembered was to matter. To be forgotten by the living was the final disappearance. Greek heroes sought glory not for reward after death, but for presence before forgetting. Fame delayed oblivion. Ordinary people sought continuity through family, tradition, and community. These were anchors against erasure. The underworld accepted everyone equally, but memory did not. This understanding shaped Greek attitudes toward time. Life was not a rehearsal. It was the main event. Death did not correct injustice. It did not balance scales. It did not answer prayers. It concluded. The journey into the underworld stripped life of urgency piece by piece. First action ended, then desire, then memory. What remained was quiet endurance. This quiet was not empty, it was spacious. Nothing pressed inward. Nothing demanded attention. The Greeks did not imagine the dead watching the living endlessly. That belief emerged later. In early Greek thought, distance grew steadily. The dead did not linger emotionally. They faded. And that fading was not framed as loss. It was framed as peace. The underworld was not a punishment for being human. It was the natural conclusion of being alive. Life burned brightly. Death cooled it. Together they formed balance. The slow journey inward ended not with revelation, but with stillness. No final lesson appeared. No voice explained meaning. Meaning had already happened. Here, beneath the world, there was no need to understand, only to remain. And that, for the Greeks, was enough. If you've enjoyed this slow journey into the Greek underworld, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories reach others who enjoy calm, immersive history and mythology. Thank you for spending this time here. Rest well.